This video goes over the call flow priority that you set up to figure out how calls are going to route to your buyers. And as you know, we're going to have multiple buyers on the same offer because, as we always say at TrackDrive, if you have an offer for health insurance already and you think you need another one for health insurance, call support because you're probably wrong. So we usually want everyone to have one offer per vertical. So based on that, we need to know, as there's 10 buyers on an offer, which buyer is going to get the most calls, in what order. So that's what the call flow priority is. Now, we always route to our buyers by tier and weight. We do have a couple of ways to calculate the tier automatically by setting the tier to the bid price or the earnings per call, but I'm going to describe how tier and weight work so that these two things will make sense. So every every time a call comes in, the system's always going to look at the lowest priority and then keep checking higher and higher. So I made a little chart here that kind of shows you if I had 3 buyers at tier 1. So I'm going to say this row here is tier 1, this row here is tier 2, and this is row tier 25. Now we always start, for lack of better words, at the top of the Excel sheet looking for the tiers to see who can we route to. Can we route to buyer 1, 2, or 3? Nope, they're either capped, they're closed, don't fit the filters set on the buyer, so we can't send to them. So we come down here and look at buyers on row 2. Can we send it to these guys? Are they capped or closed, or don't fit the filters? Nope. Okay, keep looking. Okay, here's one down here. This buyer may have no filters at all, and so he can take all the overflow calls. So we set up this guy at a really bad tier. Again, the higher the number on tier, the better, or the worse it is. So the lower the number, the better, including negative numbers, and you're about to see that in a second here. So what would happen is, that's the tier. So we always look at the lowest tier first, consider all those buyers. We wouldn't even look at buyers on row 2 or at tier 2 unless these guys can't take the calls. So these guys would get all your calls all day long. If they could always take your calls, these guys would not get any. Okay, how does the weight then work? Well, you can see here that I have on this first tier that I have buyer 1 with a weight of 1, buyer 2 has a weight of 1, and buyer 3 has a weight of 3. That gives the total weight for this tier 5. Tier 1 has a total weight of 5. So when we go to figure out how many calls to give to the buyers at each tier, well, I take the 1 divided by 5, means this guy gets 20%. 1 divided by this total weight of 5 gives this guy 20%. 3 divided by this 5 gives this guy 60%. So I'd have 20% of the calls, 20% of the calls, and 60% of the calls going to the buyers at tier 1. I also calculate what percentage each buyer would get at tier 2. So that has a tier of 10 because this is weight of 1 and weight of 9. So this guy would get 10% of the calls. This guy would get 90% of the calls. Down here where a buyer's by himself, the weight doesn't really matter, but the math is still the same. This guy has a weight of 1. The total tier weight for 25 is a 1, so 1 divided by 1 is 100% of the calls. So even though the weight wouldn't matter, we still do the calculation to say this guy gets 100% of the calls. We do try to make this as accurate as possible. It might not be if someone was closed or they didn't match the filters and it was their turn to take a call. However, it does work out in this fashion. Now, when you have multiple buyers on an offer, we will keep the call live a lot longer, because if buyer 1 couldn't take the call as the consumer is going through the filters, he'd just fall off and we go to buyer 2, or if he didn't answer, we could try buyer 2 or whatever. So it's very nice that we have all of our buyers on one offer. You drop a lot less calls. So now that you understand how tier and weight work, pretty simple if you're doing it manually. The lower the tier, the better, and then the weight gives them the percentage. If you route by bid price, that's TrackDrive automatically calculating the tier for you. And all we do is negate how much they're paying you. So up in the conversion settings, if this guy was currently paying me $30 for these calls, or $25, we're going to say that your tier would be, let's say it was for these traffic sources, your tier would be negative 30 as we were trying to route this call, because we just negate the tier. So the better this guy pays you, the more priority he has. So if he changed his price from 30 to 35, he'd start routing at tier negative 35, which is better than tier negative 30. So that's a pretty simple concept. However, not very practical to route to the highest payer all the time, because TrackDrive allows you to mix in buyers that pay you at 10 seconds with buyers that pay you at 3 minutes, and you don't know which one will be better in the long run. Obviously, the guy with the long duration is going to pay you more. The guy with the short duration is going to pay you less, but which one is going to pay you the most per call that you send? And that's what earnings per call routing is. Now, both of these have a weight involved, because if you end up with two buyers that have the same bid price, or if you're running by earnings per call, have the same earnings per call, they're going to be at the same tier. So we still need to include the weight in that. But the way the earnings per call routing works is you tell us how far to look back. Now, if this buyer's on a rev share and he's posting back to us, and it could be 2 weeks before you know if you're going to get any revenue, those type of buyers, you might tell it, and this is hourly here, you might tell it to look back 30 days of hours, so 30 times 24. You look back at the whole month to see how he's doing. But normally, pay-per-call is done by duration, so you want to do this as short as possible. So if you have a lot of flow, you would say only look back 1 hour. Let's say you're doing 1,000 calls a day and you only have 5 buyers. You would tell the system, hey, only look back 1 hour, because I want to make sure that this guy's doing well right now. Now, if you don't have much flow, maybe 100 calls a day and had 5 buyers, you might tell it to look over the whole day, because you don't have a whole lot of flow and you don't want to start routing to guys just because they did well in the last hour because they only got 1 call in the last hour. So you want it to use your judgment here based on your flow. The higher the flow, the lower the number you would tell us to look back. So I'm going to say that I have medium flow, about 500 calls a day. I'm going to tell TrackDrive, look back for 4 hours and see if he has at least 4 calls, let's say, or 2 calls, or 3 calls, 2 calls. If he has at least 2 calls in the last 4 hours, go ahead and use his real earnings per call. But if I don't meet that criteria yet, we're going to assume he's paying me $25 per call. Now, he's not going to convert 100% of calls at 60 seconds, of course, but I'm just saying assume this to be true, right? So we're going to go ahead and do it that way. Now, we don't have an update button. It does autosave. So you did see why I was playing around here, that it was not saving the record, because it wasn't saving it properly because I was missing some fields, because it's trying to autosave. But once I correct all the fields, I'm just fine. So this is saying here in earnings per call routing that I'm going to look back for a minimum of 2 calls in the last 4 hours. If I really did have that many calls, I'll check what his real earnings per call are, and it'll be negative that number. So let's say he converted half of his calls and he was paying you 25. He'd now start routing at negative 12.5, which would make his priority worse. And so he would wait to fit in until other people fell below his earnings per call. And that's how earnings per call routing works. Again, the weight still comes into play. I highly recommend that you always route by earnings per call. Even if everyone is paying you at 1 second, you will have some buyers that they ignore your calls, and we're doing this based on attempted calls. So they're going to ignore your calls. You want to punish them for that. And if they're on duration and they're never getting to duration, or even if it's 1 second, if their line's down, we'll detect that because we keep attempting them and they keep not answering the phone. So that's why I always say, even if every one of your buyers is at 1 second, I would still do earnings per call routing so that we can figure out for you that things are going wrong and stop attempting that buyer until he can repair that. And so that's how the call flow priority goes. And most importantly, understanding how tier and weight work and how we automatically calculate tiers for you.